senior U.S. Army advisor, and a member of State Department's policy planning staff. Previously, Rich served with the Office of Defense Cooperation in Ankara, fluent in Turkish, taught courses on Middle East issues at National Defense University, and one of the bright minds in U.S. government on Turkey. Very pleased to be joined with this panel. So the order is we'll all take a few minutes to present initial comments and remarks. I'll be going first, and I'll be turning to my friends to the panel. And then I'll come back and wear my hat as the moderator, and we'll kick off the discussion. So I thought I would start by bringing to your attention the map that is on your desks. And if you've already taken a look at the election outcome, comparing the two elections, but first flip to the front side of the handout, presidential election results as per BBC and another agency. Of course, the clear winner of the election is Erdogan, no surprise. Despite polls which suggested it would be a tight race, he's come out winning both the presidential and the parliamentary race. But I would say, if not just the winner, but the clear gainer of the election is MHP, Nationalist Action Party. If not for MHP support, Erdogan would have lost both polls. He would have become neither president again, nor would have his Justice and Development Party, AKP, gained enough seats in the parliament to form government. So Erdogan emerges from the election strong, but indebted to MHP. And I think MHP is the biggest surprise. Number one, it's the biggest winner. And number two, in terms of net gain and loss, it's the biggest gainer of the whole election day, in the sense that thanks to MHP, AKP now can form government in the parliament, have majority, and also it's thanks to them that Erdogan won the parliament, and as well as presidency. So I think this suggests going forward, initial takeout on foreign policy. If you thought Turkey's foreign policy had little room to maneuver on issues of Kurdish nationalism, you're going to be surprised how that room is going to narrow down in the coming days and months. MHP is a hard Turkish nationalist party. That's what its platform is. The AKP and Erdogan have already taken issue with U.S. cooperation with People's Protection Units in Syria to combat ISIS. And as you know, the YPG is an offshoot of the PKK, which is a terrorist group that Turkey has been fighting for nearly 4 decades. There is near universal support in Turkey to the U.S. policy of opposing, to Turkey's policy of opposing closer U.S. closer U.S. YPG cooperation in Syria. And I think, let me restate that, in fact, in case I mix the acronyms. There's universal support in Turkey, near universal support to oppose U.S. cooperation with YPG to fight ISIS. I think this cooperation is not going to become a centerpiece of Turkey's foreign policy with the MHP on board. And Turkey is going to voice its criticism of U.S. policy of working with the YPG more frequently and more vocally. So that's, I think the Manbij deal will hold, the deal that the governance of Manbij will be handed over from YPG to some other groups and its local inhabitants. But I can see how this is going to shrink Turkey's room for maneuver on the Kurdish issue in general, both regarding the PKK and the YPG. So that's in terms of, I think, MHP, and I'm sure my colleagues will add up and also look at the foreign policy implications of this further. So going through the list, AKP is a winner, MHP is the biggest winner and the biggest gainer. The candidate of opposition Republican People's Party, CHP, Ince, I would say himself, I was going to say he's one of the winners until last night, until the way he exited the race. He did phenomenally well. This is the first time the left crossed Turkey's 30% magic threshold since the 1990s, early 90s. The first time a leftist candidate or party crossed over 30%. The last time it happened was in 1991. It's pretty significant. I think that's because Ince is relatable, like Erdogan is. He does look like, as Erdogan does, the man from the other side of the tracks, which is Erdogan's brand that has won in many elections. Of course, Erdogan is not on the other side of the tracks anymore. He's on this side, but that's his image. It works really well for him. It's how he wins elections, by being able to relate to the common citizens and voters and their issues. I think Ince was able to do that. He was very good in terms of reaching out and becoming a relatable candidate. And he might have a future for him. It all depends on how the CHP's leadership shapes up if there was a party convention, if he were to challenge the current leader. But as I said, my only caveat was the way he exited the race. He sent a WhatsApp message to a Turkish journalist, which basically said, this guy has won, meaning this guy, meaning Erdogan, and that message was broadcast. Of course, it's not the best way for a politician who has received over 10 million votes to exit a race. People expected a concession speech or something like that, and so we'll see if he makes that up. But I think overall, he's one of the winners. He's emerged as a competent opposition leader who can challenge Erdogan. Mr. Erdogan's luck in the last 16 years was that, yes, he delivered economic growth, which is his bright side, and built a base that loves him. But he also has a dark side. He's demonized and brutalized demographics that are unlikely to vote for him. And in addition, a third factor that helped his rise is that he was blessed with a divided and weak opposition that lacked creative and competent leaders. Ince might change that. He seems to be cut from the same cloth as Mr. Erdogan is, so I think he will, if he can restore his standing, he could be a long-term challenger. Going through the list, so İYİ Party, I'm going to use a Turkish word and translate. İYİ Party did İYİ. İYİ means average in Turkish, so İYİ Party did average. Just okay, you know, not surprising, just about 10%. Though its leader, Akşener, I think, in terms of gender issues, I find this interesting. It's the first time a woman has set up a startup party in Turkey, and that party has been able to enter the political scene and become one of the key players. She set it up less than a year ago. She had literally no media access in the campaign. It was denied to her completely. The race was unfair to begin with. It was extra unfair for her. What's the English language for extra unfair? Editor? So completely unfair race, despite that I think she was able to get to near 10% of the vote. I was just discussing with my colleagues, the turnout for her was especially strong in Turkey's southwestern corner, which is the one part of the country where tourism is the main industry. I think it explains that people are more able and eager to vote for a women candidate in areas that make money from interacting with foreigners and tourists. So maybe that's a trend for her regionally, but in any case, she's also proven herself, I think, as a competent candidate, at least in the sense that he set up a party, first as a woman to enter the political scene. The closest party led by a woman came to this was Turkish Labour Party, TIP. In 1965-69 elections, they did close to 10%. She's surpassed even that. And that's in the Cold War, that's more than 50 years ago. It's Turkey that's literally and figuratively in another century. Putting all this together, I think this is where your map would make sense. The map shows kind of party support change between 2015 and 18 elections for MHP and HDP. Pull this on Twitter. As I said, I do love maps, and I think it's a fascinating one. So it shows that MHP's support dropped in provinces in Western Turkey. That's where Akşener did well. I think that's where a lot of MHP votes went to İYİ. But that also MHP's support increased across the rest of the country, including much of central, northeast, and east central Turkey. That's AKP's heartland. So I think what happened is that many AKP voters migrated to MHP, but still stayed in the Erdogan camp. In other words, they did not abandon the Erdogan camp. They're tired with the AKP that has been in government for 16 years. The party is suffering from allegations of being corrupt, as well as, I guess you could call it medal fatigue. It's been in charge for nearly 2 decades. And if you look at the bottom map, that shows support for HDP. HDP's support dropped in Turkey's predominantly Kurdish provinces. I think that shows that a lot of the Kurds, especially conservative ones, are sick and tired of the HDP trying to, or the HDP's efforts, failed efforts to bring what they call the Kobani model into Turkey. That following the YPG's model in Syria, they would take over cities, establish autonomy. That completely failed, but it also brought massive fighting into the cities in the southeast, and I think that is the kind of backlash by middle class and conservative Kurds who are saying, you know, we don't want to be caught in another PKK fight here, we want to be out of it. And perhaps that explains HDP's significant drops in all Kurdish majority cities of Turkey. But the party was still able to cross Turkey's 10% threshold to enter the parliament because it received increased support in all ethnic Turkish provinces and large increases in Istanbul and Izmir, large increases in upper middle class districts of Istanbul and Izmir. So if you know Istanbul, Şişli, Beşiktaş, Kadıköy, where support for HDP is twice their national average, 16%, 14% in some cases in Western Turkey. So I think that's, in Istanbul, there are 10 million voters. HDP received nearly 10%. That's 500,000 votes. They received twice their previous support in Istanbul. Many of those are not ethnic Kurdish voters, they are Turkish voters. So these are either Turkish liberals voting for this party because the HDP is avowedly more liberal than the CHP, or they're tactical voters who voted for HDP because they wanted to cross the threshold so that would help Erdogan, prevent Erdogan from establishing parliamentary majority. But the reason why I went through what happened to HDP and MHP voters and EA is that voters are migrating within the pro-Erdogan camp and within the anti-Erdogan camp, but not from the anti-Erdogan camp to the pro-Erdogan camp, or not from the pro-Erdogan camp to the anti-Erdogan camp. Erdogan's support in the election is 52 to 48. It's exactly the same as the referendum. That's the margins by which he won it last year. To me, it suggests that maybe we're seeing the emergence of two Turkish echo chambers. And I would also add that I think one of the fascinating parts of studying Turkey for me as a student of Turkey is that Turkey is like an onion. There's never a core. If countries will be vegetables, because you always get to find a new fact, a new interesting dynamic. So we often think of Turkey as a country that follows trends invented elsewhere in Europe and the West, because that's what the Turks have been doing for the last 300 years. Westernization, following political trends in Western Europe and the West in general. I think in the case of Erdogan, maybe the opposite is true. Turkey has invented a trend of populism. That's Erdogan, who came to power in 2002. He's built a base, as I said earlier, delivering economic growth, but also polarized the country because he's demonized and cracked down on demographics that are unlikely to vote for him. So half of Turkey adores him and thinks he's the best, and half of Turkey, almost half, loathes him and thinks nothing good can come out of it. I think if Turkey was the country that invented populism, it shows what populist leaders, when entrenched, can do. The case of Turkey, that is, then they create echo chambers. People live in two different realities, split realities, that is. So for the half that voted Erdogan, I don't think they think Turkey is an authoritarian place. They're completely free. They live in a democratic society, and that's their reality. It's true. It's not relative. For the half that opposes him, they think that they live under an authoritarian regime, and that's their reality. It's not relative. It is true. And I think increasingly the two sides are completely detached from each other. They don't understand how the other side could have a different opinion because they don't live in that world. They don't care, or increasingly, as the election outcome showed, they don't see it. So advanced case of populism, I think, produces echo chambers. That's kind of my big thing, piece for food for thought, for discussion. I think I'm doing a piece for this for CNN later on. Maybe you'll see it online. Finally, I've delivered so many pieces of not necessarily positive news. I'm known in this town as an optimistic analyst. I was targeted on Twitter yesterday for being very optimistic. So I got to present a couple of positive takeaways. One is, despite the fact that this was an unfair campaign, the race was, the vote was free. That's really important. And we might see when analysts and social scientists and political scientists and statisticians produce their outcome, what exactly happened. This is all preliminary results that I'm presenting. It was a free race. It was, with a few exceptions, unfortunate exceptions, it had no violence in it. So that really, I think, should tell us that democracy in Turkey still remains strong. Although the race was unfair, it still produced a free vote and a peaceful campaign. That's very significant, because expectations were otherwise. So I'm really happy to come up with this conclusion. And second, silver lining of the cloud, I guess, is that this is Turkey's most representative and diverse parliament since the 1980 coup. So after the coup in 1983, the generals put in place a high threshold, 10%, necessary for parties to enter the parliament. At times, that threshold disenfranchised up to 45% of the electorate, because there were many parties that failed the 10% threshold. In 2002, for example, when the AKP first came to power, it came to power with 34% of the votes, but because 45% of the vote was disenfranchised in the form of parties that had failed the threshold, it received 2/3 of the seats. The threshold has before 2002 and since disenfranchised up to 10, 20, 30% of the voters. This was the first time. It did not work at all because of the electoral pacts the parties were able to form. 99% of the electorate found their voice in the parliament. which I think is the most diverse, representative Turkish parliament since the 1980 coup. And I believe if you read my book, The New Sultan, I just had to make a shameless plug, that a lot of Turkey's current problems are rooted in the political system that the generals tried to fashion after the coup. I say try because it didn't work out. And I think the threshold is one of them, so this could be the end of the threshold for practical purposes. But it's also good that Turkey is a parliament in which all political movements and colors and parties are represented. So it may not necessarily be hard for Erdogan to pass legislation through the parliament. He controls it. But the anti-Erdogan voices will be very diverse, very colorful, and completely representative of Turkey. It's the first in nearly 40 years. So I'll end here. I know there's a lot more to go. I'll invite my colleagues in the order they're seated, and then I'll come back to Q&A. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Soner. Thanks to the Washington Institute for having us, for holding this, for kind of getting in first on sharing our commentary. So I think Soner did a really nice job of providing an overview of kind of what we saw yesterday. What I want to kind of try to focus on is, were there any surprises in the elections? Was there anything that you know was surprising to us? And interestingly, I think one of the first ones was the relative lack of manipulation that we saw. I think a lot of us who have been watching this very, very closely thought that there was going to be quite a lot more manipulation than there was. I'm not saying that there wasn't manipulation, but if you read the OSCE report that came out, which was actually very critical of the referendum in terms of the Supreme Board of Elections accepting ballots that didn't have the official stamp on them, it looks as though there was more manipulation in that referendum than there was yesterday. What's interesting is that there is a discrepancy in terms of Erdogan. Now, polls, you know, how much should we trust them is up for debate, particularly in this kind of a situation, and look at who's sponsoring them. But Erdogan was polling around like 45, 47%, and so a lot of people were thinking that this was going to go into a second round. I did not think it was going to go in a second round. I assumed that Erdogan was going to try and make sure that he won in the first round to kind of get rid of any possibility that the opposition could put up a candidate against him. But you know, winning more than 52% of the vote, that's interesting. So we want to sort of wonder where that, why were the polls not necessarily showing that? So I'm going to disagree, however, with Soner and say that these were not free elections. When in political science we talk about fair and free elections, it's absolutely clear, and he made a good point, that these were not fair. When you hold elections under a state of emergency, when you have a presidential candidate who's in jail, when you have ballot boxes being moved deliberately, supposedly for security reasons, particularly in the Kurdish southeast, such that people who don't have access to transportation or are too elderly or too ill to get to the polls aren't able to do so. The media coverage, I think, is the first and foremost thing we think about, with the AKP having access to about around 90% of media time. Whether they're state-run media or they are media outlets that are controlled or owned by holding groups that are close to the party, close to the AKP. So it's absolutely clear that these were not fair elections. But the extent to which they were free, again, if you're making it difficult for people to get to the polls, there were cases of people preventing. One of the things I think is really important to notice is the civil society mobilization around ballot boxes and making sure that whether it's Oy ve Ötesi or some of these other organizations, the Adil Seçim Platformu, trying to make sure that no hanky-panky was taking place at the ballot boxes. There were a few cases of stuffed ballot boxes being objected to by some of those civil society observers. So I think that played an important role, and I think it's actually encouraging when we look forward in terms of civil society's desire to make sure that that kind of manipulation didn't happen. But there was, again, a relative lack. I think a lot of us were kind of waiting to point to, yes, look, it was stolen, we can count on that, and we can't really do that at this point. I think the second thing that was surprising, and Soner mentioned this a little bit, was Muharrem İnce's way of exiting the election. When you have a candidate who, when the CHP first chooses Muharrem İnce as their candidate, a lot of people are kind of scratching their heads, like, is this the right guy? How are people going to be able to mobilize behind him? But he did, as Soner mentioned, have a lot of things going for him. And just his pugnacious nature, anytime Erdogan would say something against him, he comes right back with something even stronger. And I think that's something that a lot of Turks respected and were looking for. His charismatic, his use of humor, and so forth. So when you're able to go from a situation where people are saying, well, it's probably going to be Meral Akşener versus Erdogan if we go to round 2, within a couple of months being, clearly the candidate that's going to challenge Erdogan potentially. And you've mobilized all these people, and you've gotten all these votes, and social media is behind you, and there's this resilience and sense of hope that a lot of people in the opposition didn't think that they were going to feel, and there's Tamam, and there's Sıkıldık, and there's all of these campaigns. And then I was watching Halk TV actually when the message came through, and the anchor looks at his phone and he says, oh, he said the guy won. He said it wasn't fair, but the guy won, and I'm accepting. And it just felt like you were broken up with over tweet, or like over message or text or something. And there was so much that had been built up, and he apologized for that today. He finally did hold a press conference and announced. So he did apologize for that and said that was a mistake. And he did say that he's going to continue to try and push that campaign forward. My concern is that when you have a presidential system in place that you have now, the institutional space for opposition has been so constrained that it's going to be very difficult, I think, to challenge Erdogan and the AKP, no matter how resilient you are. But I do think he's been a very good example for an opposition that needed something inspiring to cling to, in a sense. The other, I think, really big surprise is the MHP performance. The polls didn't show anything like that. In fact, you had electoral law change such that the AKP and the MHP could be in this alliance. Because no one thought that the MHP would be able to get over the 10% threshold. They saw the E party split away from it. They saw a lot of people commenting that Bahçeli is kind of this old man, he's not really appreciated by people in his party. He's lost a lot of political capital and so forth. But he really comes out the winner in this, in a lot of senses. And as Soner says, this has a lot of implications for domestic politics and foreign policy, particularly around the Kurdish issue. A lot of us have been wondering whether post-election, is there going to be a political space that's opened up for movement on the Kurdish issue? Because Erdogan and the AKP don't need to continue rallying the nationalist vote and galvanizing that anti-Kurdish support as they've been so successful in doing. With the MHP and your coalition, that is constrained, that space hasn't opened up for movement on the Kurdish issue. In terms of other potential surprises, I was actually a little bit surprised that the HDP, the People's Democratic Party, makes it over the threshold. Not because they don't have the support to do so, but because the great majority of that manipulation that I was talking about, or I should say pre-election intimidation, was directed specifically against the HDP. The violence that you saw was against the HDP. The attacks on headquarters were overwhelmingly against the HDP. The fact that their candidate is in jail, that he has to tweet through his lawyer, that he gets 2 10-minute segments to address the public. And of course, he's not the only one who's in jail. There are other HDP members as well, including some of those who were elected representatives who had their parliamentary immunity lifted and then were jailed. So the fact that despite all of that intimidation and attempts to try to suppress the vote specifically in the Kurdish southeast and among HDP voters, that the HDP was able to surpass that threshold, I think was a little surprising, but very encouraging. If we want to take something that's encouraging away from the elections, that would be my take.
All right, great. So my colleagues have tried to talk a little bit about what happened yesterday, make sense of the election results. I'll try to talk a little bit about what might happen next. And as many of us discovered yesterday, it can be very difficult to predict what's going to happen next. But I think if we had to, the safest bet is that Erdogan will keep being Erdogan, maybe even more so. And what I mean from this is that Erdogan has come away, it seems, from this victory, feeling that his, you could say, combative, defiant approach has been vindicated, both at home and abroad. Erdogan's nationalist alliance worked out very well for him at the polls. And if you read what Turkish commentators have been saying over the past couple months, they're also very convinced, rightly or wrongly, that this approach has worked out well for them internationally. That, for example, Turkey's show of resolve in invading Afrin forced the United States to be more accommodating of its demands in northern Syria. In this line, I'd say that, we also have talked about Erdogan's tactical alliance with the nationalists. I might even go further and to say that the real concern is that this isn't just a tactical alliance, but something closer to a mind meld. That there's a sense amongst Erdogan and some of his allies that, unlike the more moderate figures within their own party, Turkish nationalists have been proven right. Proven right about the Kurds, proven right about the Gülen movement, and proven right about the West. And I think as Erdogan continues to face very real challenges in the coming months and years, real diplomatic challenges, real economic challenges, that this sense of vindication, this sense that his strategy has worked, will inform the way he responds to these coming challenges. Another way to think about this might be that Erdogan's narrative is one of achieving great victories for Turkey in the face of implacable, hostile enemies. And in trying to picture what might come next, I think the safe assumption is that this narrative will remain the same. And the question is what those new victories will be and who those new enemies will be. There'll likely be no lack of enemies. But the question is not just who these enemies are, but how, it's more than just being besieged by enemies, I think. Erdogan's narrative has relied on a sense of victimhood, a sense that he's fighting for his constituents. He's fighting for Turkey in the international arena, but he's fighting for his constituents domestically against an old regime, an established elite, institutions, social classes that have tried to keep his supporters down, and that at any minute could return and undo the numerous gains that Erdogan has made for his people in the course of the last 16 years. And what many people have asked is how Erdogan can continue to maintain this sense of victimhood as he becomes increasingly powerful. And this is one of the things I think we'll see play out. You've heard some discussions amongst people in the AKP that they've achieved great things. They've overcome, the old bureaucratic resistance. They've overcome the secularist military, but they have yet to establish their hegemony in the cultural sphere, in the educational sphere, maybe even in the economic sphere. So I think we'll see going forward whether, in order to maintain the narrative of victimhood, this narrative of combat within Turkey, the AKP will increasingly try to show its influence in areas like the economy, areas like education, at the expense of the people who hold those positions, who run those companies now. On the international sphere, the question is what kind of victories might Erdogan seek? Domestically, I think we'll continue to see large infrastructure projects, certainly a great deal of talk of increased economic opportunities. These kinds of victories might be harder to secure if, as predicted, the Turkish economy takes a turn for the worst. So this leaves Turkey potentially looking overseas for achievements. I think what you see in the last couple of years is that Turkey has lost some of the possibility for cooperative diplomatic achievements that used to be available. Something like visa-free travel to Europe, a truly collaborative relationship with the United States and Syria. These might have been on the table a couple of years ago. They're not anymore. And so in keeping with Erdogan feeling like his more combative approach has been vindicated, I think what you'll see is a greater effort for the kinds of diplomatic victories that can be secured by force, through pressure, in a more adversarial way. And I wouldn't necessarily completely discount these. Some of these are substantial. As the saying goes, you might get more flies with honey than with vinegar, but when you're out of honey, do the best you can with vinegar. One of our colleagues, Ryan Gingeris, has always talked about Turkey's new diplomatic strategy in terms of low-hanging fruit. I think you'll see an eagerness to champion improved relations with Venezuela, improved relations with Serbia. Not to say these aren't great countries, but these are not, this is not where Turkey's ambitions were set a few years ago. And yet, I think you'll increasingly see this being where the Turkish government goes in search of national pride and legitimacy. Finally, though, to avoid turning this into a sort of a caricature of Erdogan, I think there are a few final points that I'd make. So I've lost my voice along with my hope for the future. I apologize for. First, no one would say Erdogan wants Turkey to be as democratic as possible, but I think he wants it to be as democratic as is compatible with him staying in power. And with these elections, he's managed to maintain, I wouldn't just say a veneer of democracy, something a little more, if not that much deeper than a veneer of democracy. The structure, certainly, of democracy. And the question is how long that can last for. And in large point, as you suggested, that will depend on how the opposition responds. How long the opposition feels that the game they're playing or the playing field they're playing on remains fair enough for it to be worth them continuing to contest this according to the rules. And that very much remains to be seen. Similarly, I think it would be worth pointing out that Erdogan really wants to have good relations with the West. He just thinks those should be on his terms. There's a phrase that the MHP used years ago when discussing Turkey's EU accession. And it was that, at the point where the MHP was the least pro-EU party in Turkey, their official position was they wanted a cession but with dignity. And I think that's a nice way of thinking about the way Erdogan and his nationalist allies sees this relationship. That, if anything, you've had Turkish columnists, Turkish politicians suggesting that this now is an opportunity for the West to reset its relationships with Turkey based on the recognition that Erdogan is here to stay. They tried to destroy him, but they failed. And now it's time for the West to give Erdogan its due and work with him the way Erdogan would like. We'll see if this happens. I suspect neither Erdogan nor the West will quite behave the way both sides want. Tensions will continue, but I think it's worth thinking in terms of how Erdogan envisions this, that's worth recognizing. And then as a final point, I do think we'll see a much more combative approach from Erdogan moving forward, but it's worth remembering that pragmatism, tactical compromises have always been part of Erdogan's toolkit, and they'll continue to be. And so it's not that we shouldn't expect any concessions from Ankara. I just think when they come, and they will come, and that Washington should try to take advantage of those, but shouldn't necessarily mistake them for evidence of a new conciliatory Turkey.
Thank you. Rich, you're next.
Thanks. I appreciated the comments on the conduct of the election and on the analysis, learning from being on the panel with you guys as well as being here as a practitioner and sort of thinking about what it all means for the United States. I have been working in U.S. government on Turkey-U.S. relations since roughly 2001, which means I have a somewhat jaded and extremely low bar for optimism. So I color myself in the optimistic camp along with Soner. I think a lot of what passes for analysis of bilateral relations in Washington between the United States and Turkey anyway really is based on unrealistic expectations about the nature of Turkey as a geostrategic entity and as a polity. And it's a good clarifying exercise every now and then to go through these elections to remind ourselves a little bit about what that body politic really is. It is essentially a nationalistic realpolitik sort of a society who doesn't generally trust outside players, not its friends and not its enemies. And I think that we should not expect any election, and I didn't certainly with this election, to revolutionize that or to really make relations that much easier. Turkey will remain a difficult partner and ally. I think the questions that have been raised recently in the last couple of years really about sort of the very nature of Turkey, whether it had become something not just other than an ally, but other than a democracy, have been very troubling in terms of trying to put together policy propositions that we can discuss with the Turks. The question, and I think Soner has referred to this as reducto ad Erdoganum in the past, the idea that Turkey is Erdogan, and that's the problem. Well, that's really not useful. People used to, when we were getting involved with Iraq in 2001, 2, and 3, they used to ask, is Saddam Saddam because of Iraq, or is Iraq Iraq because of Saddam? And we bet on the latter and found that the former was more the case. And I really think that that's sort of the case here. Erdogan is, from American political perspectives, a problematic leader. Certainly the democratic issues that we have there are real and substantial concerns, but he is reflective of concerns that are shared by many Turks. And the fact that we saw a surge, I'm never surprised by a surge of MHP, because they are a receptacle for the anxiety of the Turkish people. And when the Turkish people, whether it's whipped up from within inside or driven by external events, when they feel threatened, there is sort of a nationalist reflex and response that's quite natural and quite routine. I like to think of it as sort of, in the Turkish strategic culture, this four-way balancing mechanism between the West, Eurasia, the Islamic world, and sort of turning in sort of a cultural autarky. And wherever the sense of threat is, they will balance towards the other. And right now, their sense of threat is coming to some extent from the South and also from the West. All of that's amplified by the election. So one of the reasons also that I'm optimistic is I think that post-election, there is inherently more flexibility, not just for Erdogan, but for the entire political spectrum to engage in some creative coalition building and problem solving. And actually, compared to some of my great concern over the period I've been working on Turkey issues is just the utter incompetence of the opposition, because everybody, whether you are an Erdogan fan or not an Erdogan fan, everybody, I think, realizes that political competition fosters better and more responsive governance. And there just hasn't been, I remember very clearly watching Mr. Ecevit at a very advanced age when I first got to Turkey in 2001, making his way across the stage for the 4th of July celebration at the U.S. Embassy. And I just thought to myself, great man, heroic effort, but it took him 3 minutes to get from one side of the stage to the other. There was a missing generation of Turkish political activity. AKP took advantage of that. They were organized and they were able to produce people who speak well on television, who can argue well, and who you look at and think, if you're a Turkish voter, this person could run the state if I have to. And that's why I'm upbeat about what just happened. What some have referred to as the democracy bloc in Turkey, which is this, none of them big enough to beat AKP head to head. But think about it. Now, with the number of parties we've got represented in this upcoming Mejlis, you've got more than one nationalist party, actually, between MHP and E. And I'm one who thinks that the splitting of the nationalist vote is a good thing. It opens up more possibilities for cooperation. I think I think some of the tactical things that we saw between the loaning of the 15 candidates to get E into the, or members to get E into the election, I think the visiting Demirtas from CHP, which has its own nationalist wing, these are kind of unprecedented. And so I think we saw signs of competence on the part of the political opposition that go beyond certainly what I've seen over the last 15 or 20 years of watching. So that means if there is a major crisis of confidence in the current government, people will look at some of these leaders and at some of these parties and say, well, maybe they could. And I don't think that for the past 15 or 20 years there's been a lot of confidence that if it's not Erdogan, that there is somebody else who maybe could. There was initially, in the early years of the AKP governance, there was the thought that maybe the military could, or maybe the Kemalist elites could. But I think this is different. This is growing political alternatives in Turkey. So for that reason, I am somewhat more upbeat about this. So the good news is that the conduct, as my fellow speakers here have said, reasonably above board. I think if we I want to be careful on the language I use here, but if we look at electoral irregularities, the question of whether they would be within what we might call the retail range and not the wholesale range was an open one. And I, for one, being a bit of a pessimist in geostrategic terms, thought that there was a fair chance of much worse than what we actually saw. There were in Suruc, there were 3 or 4 bags or boxes of ballots.
I was mentioning.
There was a gunfight in Erzurum, but there's always a gunfight in Erzurum. This one just happened to fall on election day. There were a couple other incidents. I think there were also in Suruc some opposition ballots that were found in the garbage. But I was very, very impressed with the civil society aspect and the CHP and the other parties challenging this, right? Getting out there to all of the ballot boxes, all the balloting locations, and not letting it go unchallenged. That's a constraint. We have democratic constraints in place in Turkey. They were not enough to win. But I also would like to say that the outcome of this in terms of Erdogan and the AKP have to have a coalition even for the majority with MHP. That implies some bargaining. We may not like all of the bargaining that goes on there because it's not necessarily aligned with ours, but it's good that he has to bargain with his own coalition. And then for some of the things that he'll need to do, he's going to have to get broader support as well from the opposition. So I think this augurs well. You look at the fact that economic bow wave is coming that's going to put some pressure on the government. There's going to be a need for some reforms. There's going to be a need for some, I think, cooperation with the opposition there. And the youth vote, I think polling data indicates that there is not a blank check or even a growing wave of support for AKP. AKP is not a spent force in politics, but it is a force that is going to increasingly be constrained and have to cooperate and negotiate. And it looks like there's partners on the other side to sort of enforce or exact some good concessions for that. So I'm much more upbeat about Turkish democracy after the conduct of the election. And again, that doesn't mean I necessarily endorse the results. But it is hard within United States government circles to deal with arguments like, well, you know, there's nothing we can do because Erdogan is X and Turkey's not a democracy or Turkey's not an ally. Those are very unhelpful, and frankly, so much of Washington is very jaded in that aspect of our relationship with Turkey that it's good to have this on the books as a reasonable exercise of democratic process. Now, the bad news is that even when you have a good election, we don't necessarily get an easy partner to deal with. Frankly, even if INJ had won, or if there was an opposition-dominated parliament rather than an AKP and MHP-dominated parliament, we'd still be looking at a country in which 45 to 50%, good solid bloc there, are kind of center-right, prickly nationalists of one stripe or another who really don't want the United States to dictate or really even influence what they're doing in their neighborhood. That's hard, because we are trying to do some very delicate and difficult things in their neighborhood, both in Iraq and in Syria, let alone the bilateral relationship between the two. So on this whole raft of issues that we have, beginning with Syria, the detention of American citizens, concerns over the state of emergency, the tone in the relationship, possible purchase of S-400s and the impact that might have on joint strike fighters, none of these are made easier by this election. But I didn't expect that. What I will say is a more democratic Turkey is one in which they can consider some compromises and talk to us in a different way. So the passing of the election itself is going to ease some of this pressure, I think, on both the bureaucracy and the elected leadership to not compromise and not look weak in the face of the Americans. Now, for our part, we also have to come up with some better policy solutions from the perspective of the United States, because even if we have opportunities here, we have to come up with mutually acceptable policies. Soner referenced the Manbij roadmap that we're pursuing. Difficult process, but this is the stuff of which sort of common alliance problems are solved. So I'm reasonably upbeat that we'll come to a mutually acceptable way forward in Syria. Now, I did make a point to call some of my Kurdish friends last night to ask about how they saw the outcomes. I think it was also, you know, obviously a concern for many in the States that HDP would not pass the 10% since they're not formally part of the electoral alliance system. I talked to a lot of non-Kurdish, even somewhat nationalistic voters who were strategically voting for HDP in this election as a check on AKP. Not a huge sample size, but I will tell you that there are some fans of Turkish even that were voting HDP in this election, which is odd and very Turkish. But I think generally speaking, the sort of more of the same is what my Kurdish friends are expecting. They well, buoyed somewhat that the HDP is in the parliament. I think many of them just shake their head at what they see as the continued, you know, sort of political debt owed by AKP and Erdogan to the MHP, and therefore expect nothing good to come out either in the domestic Kurdish issues nor in Syria and Iraq. I do think we should take note of some of the somewhat conciliatory messaging that you have to look hard, but that Erdogan was engaged in, both about the state of emergency, you know, saying before the election he was looking towards easing that. And I think there's been some things about easing tensions both with European partners and also making some progress on the Kurdish issue. I still think that this political laydown leaves intact the strategy that the Turkish establishment is pursuing now, which is peace talks after military neutralization of the PKK franchises in Iraq and Syria. So that does not leave a lot of room near term for new initiatives, and I think that was something that many in the U.S. were looking forward to a little bit more flexibility on that. But the other thing is one of the things that really drove up Turkish nationalism, I think, was what can be perceived as a metastasis of YPG control in Syria, which was sort of an artifact, if you will, of the 2015, 16, 17 period, and a necessary part in the U.S. view of the campaign against ISIS. Well, we're going to run out of ISIS-controlled territory in the very near future. There's going to be some sort of a process, whether it be negotiated or de facto, whereby probably that control becomes less than what it is now. And I don't have any crystal ball telling me how the interim political administration is going to look, or the relationship between the regime, the Syrian regime, and the areas that are currently Kurdish controlled, or whether we'll find some formula talking with the Russians to make this all happen in a negotiated rather than a violent way. I just don't know how, but what I do know is we're talking to the Turks about how to do that. I think their temperature will go down as some of their worst nightmares of this Kurdish corridor or PKK corridor become less realistic. And that is reason for optimism. So I think at the end of the day, Erdogan doesn't want a interminable perpetuation of the PKK conflict. I think he wants to be the one to solve it. But they want to solve it from a position of strength. And this MHP and EE, frankly, this whole show of strength on the nationalist right in this election is just going to strengthen that. So we'll probably see more fighting before we see an initiative to politically solve that. But I think there will be initiative at some point in the next term.
Thank you, Rich, Nick, and Lisel. Great conversations. I learned a lot. This was a great tour of Horizon to get a deeper look into Turkey's foreign policy, national security, and domestic political environments. Before I turn to the floor, I have one question. I just want to run it by the panel. Actually, more than a few, but I'll save the rest for later. AKP-MHP relationship. How do you see that evolving, staying put, consolidating, or challenges to it going forward?
So I guess my initial thoughts on that would be that Erdogan is extremely pragmatic, extremely tactical, and has partnered with a number of different groups in the past. And when he begins to see that group as either recalcitrant or even a threat, then those relations go south very, very quickly. I think about Fethullah Gülen. I think about the Kurds. I think about Assad. So I think if there are situations in which the MHP is not willing to go along with something that he, feels very strongly about. I mean, another thing to kind of think about here is that we've talked a lot about the composition of the parliament, and I do agree that it's encouraging given the number of different parties within the parliament. But that the parliament is going to have many fewer powers than it has in the past, and that Erdogan, even if he does lift the state of emergency, has an extraordinarily highly consolidated executive that he has built for himself. So I think about the visceral quality with which he looks at those. So if you think about the çözüm süreci, the solution process with the Kurds from 2013 to 2015. And part of that was that with the coming of the AKP to power, there's an opening whereby there's a party in power that doesn't see the political expression of Kurdish identity as a threat. So that's a change. It opens up the conditions of possibility. But that there's only a serious opening or outreach or process started when Erdogan wants the Kurdish support for his presidential project. And once that Kurdish support is revoked, based on a number of factors, but the Kurds believing that the AKP didn't have their back in Kobani, they didn't have their back in a lot of situations, that there's a 180, and all of a sudden the Kurds become this kind of enemy number one, and you see a reinitiation of the war with the PKK. And then there is not just to rally nationalist support from MHP voters, but also I think a personal sense of betrayal on Erdogan's part that you also see with, of course, the June 7, 2015 elections where the HDP takes away the AKP's parliamentary majority for the first time. So there's a sense of revenge and of betrayal and of anger and competition that can happen when his partners no longer behave how he wants them to. So I think it's going to depend on the extent to which Bahçeli and the MHP, as it continues, is willing to kind of toe Erdogan's line.
Thank you. Nick?
Yeah, I mean, I'd add to that. I was surprised. I heard someone on Twitter earlier today say that Bahçeli has Erdogan by the balls. And if that's true, I would suggest Bahçeli be very gentle, or else it's going to end badly for Bahçeli. What I said earlier, I think the real risk is not that sort of the power that Bahçeli has, but the clear evidence that this nationalist constituency is strong and matters and has a hold on the Turkish population, as evidenced by the MHP's support, as evidenced by the EE party's support. And in thinking about what happens next with the Kurdish potential peace process, I'm glad. I think you made a point that I've tried to articulate not quite as successfully, but right, that there's a desire for a peace process. There's a desire to solve this problem, but it has to be from a position of strength. My concern is that what's made it difficult for Erdogan to solve this problem in the past is that he's never quite achieved the strength to get the PKK to agree to a solution on terms that his nationalist supporters and nationalist rivals will find acceptable. And so I think, as you say, that Turkey will keep fighting in the hopes of getting the leverage it needs to get the PKK to agree to terms that would be acceptable to Erdogan's nationalist flank. My worry is that getting to that point politically and militarily might prove harder than Erdogan thinks.
In addition to spending some lovely years working with the Turkish military, I had an opportunity to work with the Israeli military on several occasions, and they occasionally would accuse us of being solutionists because we thought that there was a solution to every conflict. I think this term that they occasionally use called mowing the grass is the idea that threats and conflict will continue to grow. It's just that kind of region. You just have to be prepared to fight sort of perpetually and intermittently to do so. I think this idea that there is a conflict that has to be solved is a very American. It's in our interest, first of all, to see that happen because I think we want good things for both of the peoples involved. But I also think that the Turks have a very long approach to this, at least the ones that are strategic thinkers. They know it needs to be solved. I think they're willing to wait for that set of conditions to come up and to work towards it. And I actually think Erdogan, you have to remember, he actually went further and incurred more risk in that regard than any previous Turkish leader. So I don't rule that out of the realm of the possibility. But again, as you mentioned, getting to that point militarily is tough to do. I actually think of AKP as when we go back to the original question, as a coalition. The coalition is largely held together, I think, by the political skills of President Erdogan, and he is a remarkable politician. I think it is a new coalition, and it has shifted over time. I'm not sure it has the roots that the other coalitions in Turkish politics have. I actually think, I'll be a little contrarian here, I think MHP will survive AKP. I don't think AKP will survive Erdogan in the end when he passes from the scene politically, and he will one day. I don't know that there is a natural coalition that will stay from that, whereas MHP really does have that sort of center-right nationalist base in Turkish politics. They do not have a politician as gifted as Erdogan right now, and for that reason they will not obviously be the senior partner in that relationship. But it is an interesting position that they occupy because for whatever he wants to get done over the next several years really is going to come down to does MHP also want it done. I think we've seen a little bit about how that'll play out on the Kurdish issue, but what about all the other things he wants to do? So MHP's got a good hand to play if they play it well. I wouldn't agree with the statement that they are the most key and central party in Turkey, as they said last night, but I think they have surprised me with the ability to generate the traction that they now have in the system.
Quickly, I agree. I think MHP, when I was describing parties earlier and with adjectives or candidates, MHP is not only the biggest winner and the biggest gainer, but also should have added to it that Erdogan would not have won if not for MHP. So if this was a campaign he had run on his own with AKP only, he would not be the president of Turkey today, and he would not have formed government. So I think, at least in the short term, he has to feel indebted to MHP and Bahçeli knows that. So I think we'll go into the negotiations over the new cabinet and the positions for vice presidency, for which there are no clear clauses in the parliament, in the constitution, the new constitution. It says the president can appoint as many vice presidents as he wants, and there's no qualification, no confirmation. So let's see how many of these seats, or how many of these powerful seats MHP gets, and also what kind of ministerial portfolios they end up getting. If they get up defense or others, and interior for sure, that could be interesting to watch also in terms of rights, liberties, and the Kurdish issue. My second part of my question before I turn to the floor was looking at the opposition bloc. I would say, again, using adjectives to characterize candidates and parties, I would say the most elated actor after the election is the HDP, the most surprised, the most happy, because they thought they would fail the threshold. They managed to get into the parliament. They're completely relaxed. So does HDP continue to be part of the quote-unquote opposition bloc, or does it become an independent kingmaker that goes back and forth? And also, your prediction for the durability of the opposition bloc to stay together. You can do it together or separate pieces.
So I think in terms of, so I'll take the second part of the question first, in terms of the durability of the opposition bloc. I've said this before, I'll say it again. In political science literature, it's very easy to form an opposition coalition when you know what you're against. It's very difficult to define what exactly it is that you're for. And that's something that I think would be very difficult for this opposition alliance to articulate. The whole, Tamam campaign was, Erdogan unwittingly giving the opposition its uniting slogan, saying, "We are sick of you. This is, we're done with you," essentially. But in terms of trying to articulate a foreign policy or even domestic politics, there's going to be major differences on the Kurdish issue. I think it would be very, very difficult for that opposition bloc to. I mean, I actually don't see it as an opposition bloc anymore. I think it was for the electoral standpoint, and this is where the opposition was quite crafty in using the new electoral law that the AKP put in place to allow the electoral alliance with the MHP for them to do the same, to bring the Felicity Party in. What's interesting is that the E Party passes the 10% threshold, that it didn't necessarily need that anyway. So I don't see it as an opposition bloc in parliament necessarily. I see it as that was a temporary alliance to get into parliament and to try to unseat Erdogan, and that was unsuccessful. I hope I'm wrong on that. What I do think is interesting is that, often people say in hybrid regimes or electoral authoritarian regimes or however you want to characterize it, that elections don't really matter necessarily. We saw that these elections were run in a relatively democratic manner, but I think that they do because they give opposition parties experience in contesting elections, in mobilizing, in articulating messages, in potentially forming coalitions. So I think İnce's treatment, for example, of the Kurdish issue, of even previously having voted against removing parliamentary immunity from HDP parliamentarians, as well as his visit to Demirtas, I think was very encouraging. I'm hoping that represents an evolution within the CHP as opposed to a tactic that he thought would be electorally successful. And I think a lot of what happens in the Kurdish issue in Turkey is going to be hinging on not just the AKP's relationship with the MHP, but also within the CHP, how much of those sort of hardcore ulusalcı, the hardcore Kemalist secularists who are unwilling to move on the Kurdish issue, if that actually is changing.
Thank you. Nick?
Yeah, I'll just pick up there with one thought. Right, the encouraging way to read this is that, look, all the opposition parties displayed a much more cooperative, progressive, and liberal attitude, and that generated a lot of excitement. The discouraging possibility is that opposition figures will look at this and say we demonstrated a much more cooperative and liberal attitude, and we still lost, and the nationalists won, and whether within the CHP or within the HDP, that will create renewed support for taking a much more uncompromising and less liberal attitude. So.
I think we've seen a maturation of the HDP as we've seen a maturation of the other parties that are not the AKP in the past year. I would like to think that the issues that are important to them have a large area of overlap with what's important to certainly the CHP, maybe a lesser extent with E. But I think that they're going to stay because there's a purpose in staying. The AKP captured the zeitgeist of 2000, 2001, 2002. There was I think a fatigue among most Turks with where they were at in terms of democratic broadening, European Union, liberalization of the economy, the Kurdish issue, and AKP captured those concerns and provided a platform for it, and that was sort of the launching point for what was a very successful political project. Well, they've sort of run the course on most of what that purpose was about, and they're dealing with their own identity issues now. There is a real purpose for an opposition bloc right now, and the problem was there just were not people competent enough to make it work. But real concerns over whether Turkey has over-centralized authority, about its geostrategic direction, and whether there's an axis change going on, and all those sorts of things are real concerns. And ultimately, those are going to work on the AKP, some of the looser components of that AKP coalition as well. So I think as long as there's a purpose, a common purpose, and it's not just the small purpose of the election, which is it's not a small purpose, but it's the immediate purpose. There is a broader political requirement, a real political problem in Turkey that's served by having this opposition bloc. So at the risk of being optimistic and saying people will see their interest rather than the difficulties of maintaining a working coalition, I think there's real durability here. I think we're seeing the start of the next dominant force in Turkish politics.
I'll just tag on, I think, just to wrap up, we haven't seen İnce or Akşener speak yet, no formal statements, at least not before we started this panel. So it'll be interesting to see what they say and whether they can stay the competent leaders that they proved they could be for the opposition when they run those campaigns. So it'll be interesting, I think, for the future. But on the HDP side, I actually want to take a different tack and look at an issue my colleagues haven't looked at, that the HDP has crossed the threshold primarily because liberal Turks voted for them. So they have, that could be about a third of their votes. They have 5 million votes. That's up to 50 million ballots cast. That's 10%. That's about a third of their votes, and they came mostly from big cities. So HDP used to be the 5th or the 6th largest party in Istanbul. They are the 3rd largest party now. That's very significant, and that happened predominantly because of liberal Turkish voters. If you look at neighborhoods and breakdown, as I said earlier, Kadıköy, Bakırköy, Şişli neighborhoods, they did phenomenal, close to 20% in some areas. So the question is, this is the second time the HDP is given a chance to be embraced by liberal Turks. The first time that chance was in June 2015. On a similar campaign, Demirtas broadened the party's narrow, hitherto, until that moment, narrow Kurdish nationalist appeal, included a lot of liberals on the list. The party's support went from 6.5% to over 13%. It's close to that performance. And at that time, I think he missed an opportunity. He had an opportunity to become a nationwide political leader, not just a representative of Kurdish nationalism. And he missed the opportunity in the aftermath of that. So here's a second chance for the HDP, I think, given by the electorate. And I think it's genuine. So this issue of tactical voters, I want to look at it for a little bit. That people voted tactically so that HDP could cross the threshold. I'm sorry, you don't vote for HDP if you're not a closet liberal. Meaning, if you are thinking about it, you're not going to say, oh, I want to vote for them because I want them to cross the threshold. You're not going to do it if your heart is in liberalism to begin with. So I think those tactical voters are actually liberal voters who are with CHP but who are easily able to go to this party if they think that its platform is more convincing. So can Demirtas become not just the leader of Kurdish nationalism but also liberal voice? Can the party convert itself into that? It will be interesting if they do it, because I argued last time that they have a chance to grow if they followed that path. So, but if that party is transformed as a result of the process, I think that also becomes something broader than what HDP has been traditionally. Floor is now open to questions. Please wait for the mic to come to you and do identify. Is there a mic? No, we don't need a mic anymore. Yes, we do. It's in the back. Identify yourselves as I recognize you. So I have Ambassador Leaf here, and then you.
Barbara Leaf of the Washington Institute. Given what I've heard you, we've heard you describe as a deepening and a sharpening of the center-right nationalist sentiment in the public, what's the likely impact on Ankara's relations with Moscow and Tehran?
Anybody? I love Russia questions.
I'll take a stab at that, Ambassador. Good to see you. Generally speaking, the nationalists, the religious nationalists and the secular nationalists in Turkey are very suspicious of the Russians for good reasons. And I think Soner's documented was the last 20 wars that the Turks fought were all against the
17, so.
And they lost, all of them. So that is deeply ingrained. I think what you see in terms of the closening or the closing of relations and the cooperation over Syria is a result of very clear incentives to both of the national leaders and pressures that they've had from outside with the U.S. campaign to sort of isolate Russia, the CAATSA sanctions and all that sort of thing, and their perpetual interest in splitting NATO. It's very clear why the Russians would want to get. And I don't think the Turks really intended, other than the fact that they do have important economic relations with Russia, to converge with them on policy. But after the hard straits they got into, especially in 2015, 2016, the shoot down of the Russian plane, the assassination of the Russian ambassador in Ankara, and this very difficult situation they had with us on Syria, while their relations with Europe were worsening as well. I think any port in the storm, probably from the Turkish perspective. I don't see that as a long-term, because I think the statistics show that Turks really don't like Russians any more than they like Americans. I don't think this shows I think our numbers are actually better. I think they're at 4 and we're at 8 or something like that. So. As soon as we can sort of deleverage from the very complex and bad dynamics that we've got in some of our regional aspects of the bilateral relationship, I think you'll see a little bit more balancing away, even for the nationalists, away from the Russians.
I think maybe one quick aspect to think about. So I was, with the MHP-AKP relations question, I was trying to think about, what kind of foreign policy question could they differ on? And Russia could be one. There's a lot of support within the MHP in terms of how they view Turkish identity and like Turkic identity. that when Turkey was relatively quiet with Russia's invasion of Crimea, they were very unhappy about that because they saw Crimean Tatars as being a population that was subjected to Russian dominance. They see the history of Soviet dominance over Turkic populations. So there's a real strong visceral connection that a lot of MHP voters have with Turkic populations. And I could see some, like the AKP doesn't really have any identity issues that it clashes with Russia over. And its partnering with Russia allows it to carry out its campaigns in Syria against the YPG, which then, again, helps with the nationalist vote in the elections. So I would see perhaps the Russia issue as being maybe a point at which the MHP and the AKP could disagree in the future.
I would also add to that that unlike in other countries in Europe, especially in Eastern Europe, where right-wing parties generally are pro-Russia or favorable to Russia, in Turkey, in the case of MHP, that's the opposite. There's a pretty strong anti-Russian vein in Turkish nationalism, almost dominant. So a little secret, the reason why Turkey entered NATO in 1952 is not because it wanted to fight against communism, because it was afraid of Russia, which it thought had found a disguise, yet another disguise in the form of communism, to take Turkey down. So it was not an anti-communist effort necessarily, it was an anti-Russia effort. And I think that kind of anti-Russian animus shapes MHP's thinking to a large extent. And I also agree with Lisel that whereas Erdogan can cut some slack to Putin on issues of Crimean Tatars and others for the low-hanging fruit of trade and commercial ties, it'll be much harder for MHP to swallow that. So I could see Russia being an area of more divergence as opposed to, let's say, the issue of how to deal with YPG. Yep.
Can I just, yeah, I mean, first of all, and to give ourselves credit, Turkey's won one war against Russia. It was the Cold War, and we helped them.
There you go. I like it.
So that should be noted. Second of all, no, I mean,
17
to 1.
To 1, there you go.
But the most recent one. I wrote an article a while ago suggesting that Turkey, we shouldn't be worried about Turkey turning east. We should be worried about Turkey going it alone. And usually when I write articles about Turkey, I get a lot of angry feedback from Turkish nationalists. And on this one, I had people writing in to say, yeah, that's what we want. That's the way it should be. And I think that, at least in my conversations, is how a lot of people think about it, that no one wants, in the words of some nationalists, that Russian hegemony to replace American hegemony. They don't want to move into the Russian orbit or the Russian sphere of influence. They see themselves as trying to move out of the American sphere of influence, and Russia is a potential partner in doing that.
Just quickly, since I was quoting myself before we turned to Bilal's question, the 17 number is, although Turkey has defeated the Russians in individual wars, it was the overall campaigns at the end of which the Turks were usually defeated, and the number 17 is also the number of campaigns that the Russians initiated. So Turkey was never the initiator of wars historically. That's, I think, one reason why there's a strong anti-Russian animus that drives Turkish foreign policy, especially potent MHP. Bilal?
Thank you very much. This is Bilal Wahab, also from the Washington Institute. My question is simple. Who speaks for the Kurds in Turkey? Because according to some numbers that I saw this morning, I'm not sure if verified or not, in fact, the AKP has more Kurdish members, has put more Kurdish members into the parliament than the HDP did. So you just praised the HDP for not being exclusively Kurdish. And yes, maybe that's a good thing for a Turkish political party, for an opposition political party. But if the AKP has more Kurdish members in parliament, then maybe Erdogan is right by saying that he represents the Kurds. So again, the question, who represents the Kurds? And then maybe a follow-up to that is, how independent does this election help the HDP to be of the PKK? If the analysis that the PKK was kind of playing partly spoilers to the peace process and discouraging the HDP last time around to work with the AKP. Thank you.
I think one way to think about this, and I think that it's unfortunate that often the Kurds are treated as a monolith. But if you think about who speaks for the Kurds, it's like asking who speaks for the Turks. And as we see, no one speaks for the Turks. There are incredibly deep ideological and political divides that shape that. So when you think about Kurds, and this is not just within Turkey alone. Obviously, you have massive differences across with Iraq and Syria and Iran and the Kurds there. So often when people speak of a Kurdistan that's united, that's much more kind of an idealistic way of thinking about things than anything that could potentially form itself, even just given the clan rivalries and linguistic differences and religious differences and political differences and economic differences, and the Iraqis have oil and the Kurds in Turkey don't, and so forth. So I think when you say who speaks for the Kurds, it's important to recognize that the AKP will often say this is a common platform or a common theme that they say, well, we have a lot of Kurdish politicians. But those Kurdish politicians are part of a party that's enacting policies that other Kurds find abhorrent. So there are Kurds that support the PKK, there are Kurds that absolutely do not support the PKK. There's no way of thinking who speaks for them because they're so incredibly diverse on a number of different levels.
Do you guys have anything?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I should say one of the more potentially long-term optimistic trends that you could possibly identify is that you've had a much increased willingness to acknowledge Kurdish identity, Kurdish culture, but done in a very calculated or careful way. And that I think the AKP in particular has been very effective at weaving what you could call a kind of anti-HDP multicultural narrative. In that, you know, in the past where the emphasis was on everyone being Turkish, everyone being speaking Turkish, everyone being culturally Turkish, you now have a much greater willingness to talk about the cultural diversity within Turkey. But this comes in the form of highlighting, you know, there are Laz, there are Circassians, there are Bosnians, there are Tatars, there are Arabs. And everyone can be very proud of these identities, everyone can celebrate these identities, but the follow-up question, and there can be Kurds, and you can be proud of your Kurdish identity, but the follow-up question is always, well, look, you know, we Laz, we Cherkez never demanded linguistic rights, we never rebelled against the state, we were, you know, we played our role, we were good, obedient citizens.
Ethnic minorities.
Right, and using these good ethnic minorities against the bad ones, against the nationalist Kurds. And in the historic context, you know, yeah, you now see people talking about the Turks and the Kurds. They fought together at Manzikert, they fought together in the Ottoman times, they fought together in the War of Independence. You know, and now we see in Afrin they continue to fight together against PKK terrorism. And this narrative seems to have, there are people who buy into this narrative, and this narrative opens up political space to make progress on certain issues. But as long as that's the only narrative, as long as that's the narrative when you talk about cultural diversity, and refuse to recognize why there have been any ways in which this relationship was not as harmonious as the government wants it to be, and why that unharmonious or oppressive aspect of it might have led people to support the PKK, until you're willing to take that narrative into account and the narrative of people who are Kurdish ethno-nationalists, I think its impact will be limited.
Yeah, and I think AKP has a case to make. A friend of mine who's associated with AKP intellectual circles, who's Kurdish, I asked him the same question at one point. Does it not create some tension for you personally that, you know, that your ethnic background is such that there are many people who are critical of the party's policies, but you support the policy? And he said, look, ethnically, I'm a Kurd. Religiously, I'm a Muslim of the Shafi'i sect, and politically, I'm a Turk. He says these things are no longer in contradiction to one another. So I think that formula actually works for conservative Turks. It doesn't necessarily work for people who are ethno-nationalists or people who are less sanguine about either the party or about the history of the Turkish Republic. But I mean, we also forget, aside from the linguistics and the party affiliation, the second largest Kurdish armed force in the world is not actually the PKK. I think after the KDP Pesh, I think it's the Geçici Kuvvet Korucular. So there's an armed force, there's a political movement. AKP, it does speak for many Kurds at the end of the day. Now, for people who support a different vision, you know, sort of the other end of the spectrum, there has to be a solution as well. That can't be the only answer, and I guess we'll see how expansive this government's going to be able to be in approaching those issues.
And just to add an historical tidbit on the Kurdish discussion, it's one of the issues I tried to grapple with in my first book, which I wrote many years ago, called Islam, Secularism, Nationalism, Who's a Turk. It's one of my favorite works. I think the Kurds are different from the other non-Turkish communities in Turkey, and there are many of them when you add them up, in the sense that they're autochthonous, whereas all the other non-Muslim communities, Bulgarians, Greeks, Albanians, Circassians, and there are more of them than there are Kurds. In fact, there's probably about 10 million or so Circassians in Turkey. The others are expellees into Turkey from Europe or from Russia. So I think that's a different experience of nation building versus the Kurds who are actually from there and therefore haven't lost their networks or identity or traditional leadership or elites during the expulsions that people from Greece, Bulgaria, Macedonia, and Balkan and Russian territories went through. So that's clearly, I think, where the Kurds are different vis-a-vis Turkish nationalism than all these other populist, non-Turkish ethnic groups have been, which is why I think they have more difficulty passing into Turkishness as opposed to Bosnians, who are also ethnically not Turkish, but they consider themselves only Turkish in most cases, not even hyphenated anymore. So that's it. You can buy my book. So. Yeah, question here and then in the back. So please. First in the front here.
Herbert Regenbogen, professor of Touro Law School. You speak of justice as a part of the elements in this discussion today, and yet what is the geopolitical nature of justice related to religion when it comes to its impact on the relationship between the MHP and the AKP in terms of Cyprus, in terms of the role of Hamas in the Israeli-Palestinian issues, and Nagorno-Karabakh?
I'll venture. So I think I can address that at the level of rhetorical mobilization. I think obviously this idea of the AKP and Erdogan as the sort of the voice of the oppressed works at a certain level within Turkey to some of the traditionally non-elite populations, but also works regionally. I think the idea that either Turkic peoples or Muslim peoples have been oppressed by the system in all the places that you mentioned, with the war in Nagorno-Karabakh, Syria, obviously, the Hamas cause. I think that is an underappreciated source of political strength for Erdogan, because he's able to put himself as the voice of the oppressed regionally. How that plays into the dynamic with MHP, I'm not sure. They really don't cast quite such a wide net with regards to for whom they feel sympathy. I think for Turkic populations that works at a certain level, but I think for the religiously oriented base of the AKP coalition, so to speak, these are powerful themes, and they keep feeding lots of ammunition to him, which I think he's skillfully parlayed into political capital.
I think it's also worth, I like the way that you frame this as in terms of a rhetorical tool. And it's something that Erdogan has been able to, from a victimization standpoint, he's been able to kind of push back against secularists, and he's been able to represent those pious Muslims within Turkey, and then, of course, sort of on the regional stage to speak for the Palestinians in particular. I think that's the cause that he's championed the most in terms of organizing opposition against the U.S.'s decision to move the embassy to Jerusalem and so forth. I think that gained him a lot of political capital. What I think is important to go back and consider is, again, yes, he is a conservative, pious person himself, and he can use that rhetoric quite effectively. And you see that particular line of identity salience much more in AKP's outreaches than you do the MHP. The MHP voter base in general is conservative and pious, but the AKP's strategy has been much more focused on mobilizing around Islam. But that can only go so far. So when Turkey had opened its borders and was sort of welcoming in Syrian refugees, for example, a lot of the discourse was about these are Muslims who, we need to take care of them. We're the big Sunni Muslim brother in the region. We can take care of them. And from a moral, relative moral standpoint, can say, look at the EU and the US. They don't want them. We do. We'll take them. But when polls start to show that Turks are no longer excited about the prospect of these Syrians, taking their jobs and in their minds creating crime, and they'll talk about, I go down the street and everything's in Arabic. This isn't Turkey anymore. So that rhetoric can only be used so far. There's often a pushback. So yes, Erdogan can say that he speaks for Sunni Muslims, but often there's pushback against that kind of outreach as well.
I think justice has been and is a key part of Erdogan's platform. In Islamic thinking, the concept of providing justice is one of the attributes of a good ruler. So you hardly find parties rooted in political Islam that call themselves Party of Freedom, but it's mostly about justice. That's, Adalet wa Ihsan in Morocco and elsewhere. So I think it's a very big theme for his voter base, that the party is seen as one that delivers justice. And as I said, I think for the half of Turkey that votes Erdogan, it does deliver justice, because that's the echo chamber. I think that's he has been able to build. But clearly, I think it's a big part of his branding and his political aims. We have time for a couple more questions. In the back, yep, you've been waiting.
Maury Amate, and this was an incredibly expert panel. And I wonder how much confidence they have in U.S. policymakers who will be dealing with Turkey, and who they think the main players will be with the new national security lineup.
This would be Erdogan and Erdogan and Erdogan and Bahçeli.
But from the U.S. administration perspective, there has been, particularly on the arming of the YPG issue, a lot of frustration. I think legitimate frustration amongst Turkish officials who, they're dealing with Rex Tillerson, and then he's gone, and they're hearing one thing from Donald Trump, and they're hearing another thing they're seeing other things play out, particularly on the YPG issue, but that's not the only issue. So I think there has been frustration that, from the U.S. perspective, that they're hearing a lot of mixed messaging, and they don't necessarily know who their interlocutors should be. I think moving forward, and I think also the selection of, say, John Bolton is something that does not necessarily go over very well in Turkey, but they are going to have to deal with those that they have to deal with. I think if the U.S. could be able to be more consistent in the messaging that they've been using, particularly on the YPG issue. And I think one thing, not just mixed messaging, but I think that the U.S., at least in some aspects, underestimated how strongly Turks felt about the YPG issue, and that they saw that as a legitimate security concern, and they saw this as a betrayal of a NATO ally. How can you be arming a terrorist group that you call the PKK a terrorist group, but you don't call the YPG a terrorist group? Clearly, there are links between them. So I think a closer attention to the issues that Turks take very seriously, as well as sending coherent messages to the Turkish government, I think is going to be very important moving forward.
I would add it has not been helpful to not have an ambassador in Ankara for quite some time. There's good news on that front. One of our very experienced, very talented senior foreign service officers, Ambassador David Satterfield, will be heading out there this summer. That will address, I think, a significant portion of the gap. Phil Kosnet, our DCM out there, has done fantastically. We've got a very skilled and dedicated team at the embassy in Ankara, but it has not gone unnoticed in a very status-conscious Turkish political culture that we haven't had an ambassador there for a while. Our Assistant Secretary for European Affairs, Wes Mitchell, is very involved on Turkey affairs. It was the case that Secretary Tillerson and National Security Advisor McMaster both developed a certain expertise over the course of a year and a half working these issues. Their transition out and the transitioning in of Secretary Pompeo and National Security Advisor Bolton has introduced some discontinuity, shall we say, but I think they're also getting up to speed on these issues. It is the case for any Secretary of State and for any National Security Advisor that the alligator closest to the boat is going to be what's important to the president, and that's been mostly North Korea, mostly Iran policy, those sorts of things. But I feel quite confident that they will come up to that same level of expertise, but I think that probably the greatest good that's going to happen in the near term in this regard is Ambassador Satterfield's posting.
Any other questions before we wrap up? Okay, I'd like to invite you to give a round of applause to my panelists. Fantastic job. Thank you so much.
So, if I can just add one thing, I should have said at the start, all of my comments were in my role as a personal commentator and not the views of the Department of State or the Department of Defense. My colleagues from State would scold me were I
Thanks for noting. Thank you. This is live stream. We have thousands of people join us, but feel free to share the link. Go later on if you missed any part of the conversation to look it up online. And stay tuned for more coming from the Washington Institute. And thanks for coming.
Thanks for hosting.